The Plays of Una Marson. Narrated by Ayesha Casely-Hayford.
Una Marson, feminist, activist, thinker, nationalist, broadcaster, producer, editor. Writer in Jamaica and England, across the 20s to the 60s of the 20th century she wrote columns, features, reports, poems, manifestos, radio programmes, plays. She edited and published journals, produced culture, and she was the first black radio producer to be employed by the BBC. An unquestionable polymath, Marson has now become acknowledged as a major playwright. And yet her fourth play, Pocomania, held as among the most important Caribbean plays ever written, and credited with representing the birth of Jamaican national drama, is rarely performed, and London Calling almost never. In fact, London Calling and Pocomania were only first published, thanks to Jamaican publishers Blouse and Skirt Books, in 2016, a full 52 years after Marson's death. Another of her plays, At What a Price, remains unedited and unpublished. Of her plays, London Calling is the one that links Britain and Jamaica, places that are so different and yet, when analysed under Marson's lens, reveal uncomfortable truths in the similarities of how they are divided by class, gender and race. It's a play that richly deserves further study, and to be revived on our stages to share its continued relevance to today's society. But wait, we have already gotten ahead of ourselves. This is not a straightforward narrative. But how can it be? To respectfully speak of Una Marson and her play London Calling, we must journey through a defining decade known as the formation of national consciousness and the breaking of loyalty to the British Empire. Marson's life and work sits against the backdrop of the tense dramatic history of the 1930s and all that then followed during the times she lived. Furthermore, to present London Calling without this deep level of context would deprive us of an opportunity to gain a nuanced and subtle understanding of the play and to see how it is a work filled with complex human emotions to which we all may relate. We will begin with Marson's younger years, then journey with her across the Atlantic and share her global viewpoint of the black political struggle. We will walk alongside her exploration of the advancement for mutual awareness, solidarity, and collective advantage for people of African descent as she goes between England, Jamaica, Italy, the USA, and Switzerland, writing plays and poetry, forging relations with the BBC, and living through World War II. As with every life, it will be quite a ride. Let's begin. Una Maud Victoria Marson was born on February the 6th, 1905, in Sharon, a village in St. Elizabeth, one of Jamaica's largest parishes in the mountainous southwest of the island, not far from the port of Black River, and 90 miles from the capital Kingston. The area is now a major centre for tourism, but it was once one of the most prosperous port regions in the Caribbean. Marson came from a comfortable background. Known in the community as Parson's Baby, she was the youngest of 9 siblings and step-siblings, the daughter of Reverend Solomon Isaac and Ada Marson, Solomon being a highly respected Baptist minister. It was a background that not only gave Marson the opportunity for a wide-ranging education, but it provided her with a lifelong insight into the workings of people and their struggle for equality in society, a theme that would come to feature repeatedly in her writings as an adult. As was the custom in those days for those who could afford it, Marson's family sent her to do her high school years in Kingston, a crucial move that allowed Marson to build on the education that she had already garnered from reading the volumes of poetry and history in her father's library. Hampton School for Girls is one of the oldest boarding schools in Jamaica, founded in 1858, and at the time Marson went there, her father was on the school board. Hampton offered everything that a young English lady could need: elocution, deportment, refined conversation, gardening, concerts, and musical appreciation. Marson was a diligent student, but her experience of the school, with its favouring of its fairer-skinned and white pupils, who were also from rich families, had an unhappy side. As a dark-skinned scholarship girl, meaning that she didn't come from a rich family, Marson was made to feel inadequate both socially and racially. But she was aware that public school, the confusing British term for private school, was not the place to rebel, and instead she busied herself with expanding her horizons through the school's well-stocked library, where she immersed herself in the world's poets. Wordsworth was a particular favourite, and applied herself to studying subjects like Latin and French, and of course, English literature. When it came to finishing high school, Marson decided not to take the qualifying exams for further study, even though it was clear to all that she would be a perfect candidate for university. In the West Indies, however, her options were few, and to go overseas for further study, you needed your family's financial backing, which Marson's own family was not in a position to provide. In Jamaica, career paths for women at that time were limited, even for an educated woman. Teacher? Governess? Nurse? Secretary? So when Marson left school in 1922, like so many women of her generation, she studied shorthand and became a stenographer, a secretary, feeling that, as she said herself, she had neither the will nor the talent to become a teacher. She was well aware that the job of a secretary was one of the few avenues open to women in Jamaica to give her an independent income in modern life. And returning to her hometown in St. Elizabeth was not an option, as her father had died after she had started school in Kingston, and her mother had moved the family to the capital. Marson's first steps into employment defined her lifelong commitment to social justice when she started to work as a secretary for the Salvation Army and the YMCA in Kingston, both of which organisations work to help the disadvantaged and, most importantly, to give them a leg up in society. Outside of work, Marson was already busy writing and becoming a familiar face on Kingston's arts circuit in literary societies, theatre, amateur dramatics and music. At the age of only 18, she produced a play for the YMCA in 1923, an adaptation of Susan Proudly, a novel by Herbert Delissa, Jamaica's Charles Dickens, that had been serialised in the Gleaner newspaper. The Gleaner was the leading daily paper of the West Indies, of which Delissa was its long-serving and influential editor, and one of the newspapers that Marson would later write and edit for. We have few details of the production, but we do know that the play was well received. Susan Proudly tells the witty yet socially conscious story of Susan, a young downtown woman whose ambition and looks take her uptown to ascend the social ladder via her romantic encounters with three men. You can see the attraction to the plot for Marson as Susan Proudly documents how its protagonist negotiates the realities of her class, colour and gender in order to advance herself economically and socially. The show starred actor and comedian Ernest Couperdon, a pioneer in performance by bringing Caribbean dialect and patois to Jamaican theatre, and Marson herself made her theatrical debut. In 1926, she combined her writing skills, honed as a secretary, with her social vision to become a journalist, joining the Jamaica Critic as assistant editor on the socio-political paper. 2 years later, she co-founded The Cosmopolitan, a monthly magazine for the business youth of Jamaica and the official voice of the Stenographers Association, representing the rights of secretaries throughout the country. She was the first woman in Jamaica to be an editor and publisher, just one of the many firsts in her life. In the inaugural issue of The Cosmopolitan in 1928, she wrote in her editorial statement that our chief aim is to develop literary and other artistic talents in our island home, to encourage talented young people to express themselves freely, and proclaimed, "This is the age of woman. What man has done, woman may do." Marson's creative side also continued to grow, and she printed 2 volumes of poetry, Tropic Reveries in 1930 and Heights and Depths in 1931. The poems in both collections largely focus on love, nature and Jamaica. Though they do not prepare you for the starkness of the poetry that Marson later wrote in London during the 30s and 40s, there is already a voice formed in their pages of a woman who was beginning to assert her identity and to fight for her rightful destiny. In 1932, Marson raised the funds to produce a play that she herself had written, At What a Price. She staged it at the Ward Theatre, the main theatre in Jamaica. Co-authored with Horace Vaz, although it is believed that the script was mostly Marson's work. At What a Price is a comedy drama whose protagonist, Ruth Maitland, travels from her village in the country to work in the big city Kingston as a secretary for a white businessman. After she becomes pregnant with her boss's child, she realises that she has been exploited all along. She decides to turn her back on it all and go back to her village to her parents and a former admirer. Like the earlier Susan Proudly, At What a Price explores a feminist argument that marriage does not hold all the answers. And while Ruth in some ways does not achieve the independence and status she wants to have in society, she does gain personal independence through the realisation of her own agency by making decisions for herself. As we'll see, this is a theme that drives each of Marson's plays. The central characters are women ploughing a lone furrow through life, fighting male colonial colourist obstacles to their right to choose how they should lead their lives, exploring why the refusal to accept the chains of a patriarchal system should mean sacrificing personal independence or national identity. At What a Price was a success critically and at the box office, but Jamaica was too small to build a theatrical career if you were homegrown talent, being more dependent on the travelling companies from Britain and America. But the play certainly helped raise Marson's profile as campaigner, editor, and writer of fierce polemics. With only the money that she had made from At What a Price in her pocket, and a £50 return ticket, she set sail from Kingston on the SS Jamaica Settler, landing at Plymouth on July the 9th, 1932. She declared that this was to be just a 3-month break. In fact, she ended up staying in England for 4 productive, exciting, revolutionary years. Through the expatriate Jamaican community, she found herself lodgings in Peckham, in South London, at the home of her fellow countryman, Harold Moody. He was the pioneering doctor who had just founded the League of Coloured Peoples, a civil rights organisation inspired by America's National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, and designed to campaign for racial equality across the world, particularly black rights in the United Kingdom and the British Empire. Dr. Moody recognised his new lodger's own civil rights credentials along with her journalist expertise, a winning combination that saw her become editor of the League's influential magazine, The Keys. And so the League of Coloured Peoples proved to be her instant portal into the metropolis that was the heart of the empire and hub for Black British, Caribbean and African activists to make their case for equality in the mother country. With similar speed, she also became a sought-after speaker for campaigns for women's rights, both British and international. While her profile rose as an activist, Marson's bank balance didn't rise, since her position at the League was voluntary, unpaid. She needed to find paid work, but the blatant racism that faced black people in Britain meant that a job as a journalist or secretary, both of which she was highly qualified for, was hard to come by. As she recalled, "I tried to register for work as a stenographer. One agent told me she didn't register black women because they would have to work in offices with white women. Another agent tried to find me a position and he told me that, though my references were excellent, firms did not want to employ a black stenographer." The rejection of her job applications and the racial prejudice on the street affected her confidence greatly. And yet, she was also learning about life in Britain and how to counter the false notion of race, especially through culture. As she began to analyse this in detail in her writings, a visible confidence in her grew that even manifested itself in her appearance. She stopped straightening her afro-textured hair and went natural. And in 1933, she felt sufficiently motivated to produce a London version of At What a Price. Directed by Clifford Norman, the play was staged at the YMCA hostel in central London as a fundraiser for the League of Coloured Peoples, performed by a once-in-a-lifetime cast, drawn mainly from the League, which included Marson as Ruth and Harold Moody playing her shopkeeper father James. The 2 white roles were played by black actors. The production then moved to play 3 nights just up the road at the 1,130-seat Scala Theatre, where it was favourably reported as the first black play staged by a black company in the West End with a black creative team. The West Africa Journal called it a capital rendering of middle-class life and a delightful Jamaican comedy. Commenting on the diversity of black voices under the headline "All-coloured play of many accents," the Daily Herald newspaper reported, Some spoke the heavy, rich language of the African coast, others in the staccato sing-song tones of Jamaica, and a few natives of London with a genuine Cockney accent. Next to the name of each performer, the cast list in the play's programme puts their country of origin, and this 4-act play with 20-odd performers reveals an impressive selection of the nations that reflected the black diaspora in London: St. Lucia, the Gold Coast, Bermuda, British Guyana, India. Next to Marson's name, of course, we read Jamaica, while the Jamaican-born Moody confidently states England. At What a Price also made a powerful political statement by the mere fact of its staging. As the keys informed its readers, this all-colour production aimed to bring home to the British public the fact that we can manage our own affairs effectively and therefore need not to be forever under tutelage. It will also bring our own people together and help us have more confidence in ourselves, dissipate from among us any inferiority complex in ourselves, and assist us to find a basis for fuller cooperation among ourselves. Its effect must also spread overseas and be a source of inspiration to our race. In the 1930s, London had become a political and cultural headquarters for Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism, bringing together international activists from the Caribbean, Africa, America, Asia, and Europe. The black cultural campaigners and the modernists, who were centred around areas such as Bloomsbury, Hackney, and Peckham, shared common causes of equality and self-determination with the Harlem Renaissance poets and writers, Caribbean and African students, nationalists, musicians, leaders, and politicians. These were exhilarating times, and Marson was at the thick of it as she aimed to break through ceilings that were not glass, but oppressively opaque. On one notable occasion, she became the first Jamaican woman, in fact, the first black woman, to speak at the International Alliance for Women for Suffrage and Equal Citizenship Conference in Istanbul in 1935. As the Manchester Guardian reported, she brought a new note to the assembly and astonished them by the vigour of her intellect and by her feminist optimism. In representing the League of Coloured Peoples, Marson encountered all sorts of personalities. Some she liked, others less so. Sir Nana Ofori-Atta Omeni was a Ghanaian king who arrived in London as head of the Gold Coast delegation. Its mission was to convince the Colonial Office to give more representation for Africans in the governing of the West African colony. Charming, educated and rich, he was welcomed by Marson on behalf of the League of Coloured Peoples. The pair became close companions for the duration of his stay. It was through their many conversations that Marson learnt much about African politics and culture, and this would inform and deepen her understanding of Pan-African politics, making her keener than ever to work to hasten the deconstruction and influence of colonialism. The friendship most certainly led to the creation of one of Marson's London Calling characters, Prince Alotta, as we will see when we come to look more closely at the play. Marson had quite a different response when she encountered Paul Robeson. Already show business royalty, the African-American singer and actor was a familiar face to British and European audiences both on film and on stage. He was also a fearless activist, and in 1934, writing in the New Statesman and Nation, he championed African culture and proposed setting up a West End theatre to stage black plays. Marson penned a riposte, which appeared in the same newspaper, declaring that black people the world over needed to first of all learn how to unify themselves before calling for a unified black culture. Black people, she went on, worry too much about what the white man thinks of him and too little about what they are themselves in the eyes of the people of their race. The article polarised opinion amongst her readers and, instead of uniting Marson and Robeson in a logical single front to promote black culture, it created permanent friction between these giant intellects. On the more political front, there was His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. Marson had been invited in 1935 to work in Geneva as a temporary expert at the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations. This was the year that Abyssinia, as Ethiopia was known, was invaded by Italy at the order of its fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, precipitating an international crisis. Abyssinia's ruler, Haile Selassie, was forced into exile and went to London. Marson rushed back from Geneva to offer her services to his government, which they accepted. She became Haile Selassie's personal secretary in London. The experience gave Marson further insights into the global politics of colonialism on the one hand, and the complexities of black national identity on the other. She went back with Haile Selassie to Geneva, where he made his momentous appeal to the League of Nations for it to impose sanctions on Italy to force the Italian fascists to withdraw their troops from occupying his nation. As we know from history, Haile Selassie's appeal for help was ignored, including by Britain, and Italy was given the right to possess its new colony, a black independent kingdom that had existed for 650 years, was now betrayed by Marson's own mother country. Overcome by the hopelessness of the Abyssinian occupation and the failure of Britain to support the kingdom, Marson's health began to suffer. Advised by her doctor that she was heading for a nervous breakdown caused by overwork, Marson felt it wise to sail home to Jamaica in September 1936. The Jamaica Marson returned to was an even worse political and economic upheaval than when she had left it. True to her cultural activism, Marson documented what she had witnessed of the labour revolt and the effects of the Depression in a short play, which we know little about, and she continued to write impassioned, incisive columns in the press, just as she had back in London. She became a regular columnist for Public Opinion, the weekly paper of the People's National Party. Her vision was as firmly political as it was poetic when she wrote, in 1937, "Are we to remain strangers in our own land, eaters of the crumbs that fall from the tables of others, when we have it in our power to sit at a table well garnished by our own hands?" Creatively, Marson was undeniably on a roll, and her writing in this area received deserved acclaim. In 1937, she published her third volume of poetry, The Moth and the Star, a startling 100 pages of steel in velvet observations on Jamaican attitudes as seen through her London eyes. Many poems dealt nakedly with race and colour, particularly as they affected black women. Delia Jarrett-Macauley, Marson's biographer, provides a revealing insight on Marson's poetry. Writing against the cult of ideal womanhood, Marson portrayed black women as strong, attractive beings, challenging social conventions and taking pleasure in their sexuality. Whiteness had become for Marson a devaluing force for the black woman, associated with lack of confidence in her beauty, confused sexuality, fear of invisibility, and fear of isolation. In her poem, Cinema Eyes, a mother, who as a young woman used to adore the beautiful white faces of the screen, tells her daughter, "Come, I will let you go, when black beauties are chosen for the screen, that you may know your own sweet beauty and not the white loveliness of others for envy." And, she admonishes, "I know that love laughs at barriers of race and creed and colour, but I know that black folk, fed on movie lore, lose pride of race. I would not have you so." Marson had opened up a new direction for Jamaican, Caribbean poetry, swapping the dreamy world view of the white English romantic poets for the cut and thrust passion and the blues of American writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and James Weldon Johnson. 1937 to 1938 was the peak of Marson's creative output when, in the space of just 6 months, she published The Moth and the Star and produced her plays London Calling and Pocomania, both productions sharply observed wake-up calls, mirrors thrown up to Jamaican society. They all joined to form a trilogy of landmark works whose voices and themes still resonate with us today. Pocomania, Marson's last major creative work, is a drama set in a parish town like her hometown Sharon. It was hailed as the birth of Jamaica's national drama by the Gleaner daily newspaper. It was, according to the Jamaican Times, a landmark in what we hope to refer to in the future as Jamaican theatre. Subtitled a 3-act play of native life in America, Pocomania is exactly that in its observations of middle-class Jamaican society and their condemnation of Pocomania, a syncretic grassroots religion that takes its origins from Africa. Marson's character descriptions say it all. The main protagonist is Stella Manners, an unconventional young woman. Stella's father is a stern Baptist deacon. Her suitor David is a typical young West Indian doctor. All were instantly recognisable characters from Jamaican society. Stella is very clearly a rebel against convention, who, much to her father's disapproval, has the habit of slipping away from the family home to observe the Pocomania spiritual gatherings run nearby by Sister Kate. There's a compelling prologue to the play that shows Stella as a child, already attracted without knowing to the mystery and passion of the drums and chants she can hear in the tropical night. Pocomania. The name means a little madness in Spanish, a corruption of Cumina or Pocomania, one of the revivalist cults that emerged during the 19th century as a cultural resistance by Jamaicans to the missionary Christianity on the island. Based on the beliefs and traditions brought by slaves from the Congo, Cumina offered spiritual equality and put women to the fore as spiritual leaders. Pocomania challenged the Christian patriarchy of mainstream society who, where they couldn't stamp out the grassroots religion, ensured that it was seen as subversive, associated with poverty, primitive beliefs, ignorance, and therefore a block to social advancement. Stella's struggle to share both worlds reflects a much wider range of divisions in Jamaica, where Christianity is a weapon that enables the class system, blocks culture, and keeps women in their place. Drawn by her curiosity, Stella eventually gets to know Sister Kate and to learn about revivalist life. Stella begins to understand why she has always felt the power of the drums. "Through the drum the spirits speak," Sister Kate explains. "The Lord himself speak to the soul of him people." But working class Sister Kate is under no illusion that Stella's higher social background will bar her from the world of Pocomania. Discussing this with members of her congregation, she concludes, "Yes, but I don't keep with respectable ladies like she for come to the meetings. Them can't understand it. It is not possible to be respectable and common at the same time." Ultimately, Stella is caught up in the crossfire when her concerned family class refuse to tolerate her fascination with Pocomania anymore. When not long after the death of her childhood friend John, who she loved and was engaged to, there are hints of marriage to John's brother, David, Stella's response is to run towards and submerge herself within Pocomania. In the meantime, Sister Kate passes away, and with it, the freedom she offers to Stella. At the end of the play, David speaks with Stella. "No more Pocomania, then?" "No more Pocomania. I was always frightened of it, but I had to have something." "I shall try to give you something better." "A little madness?" "Yes, I suppose love can be called that as well. We all need a little madness in our lives, perhaps." "Now you have admitted that, it will be so much easier to love you." Marriage proves an unsettling binary choice on so many levels, as we see from Stella and David's final bittersweet scene. Stella warily accepts that she needs to move back into her class now that Sister Kate has died. But in receiving the good of the respectable society that seeks to reclaim her, she must renounce the perceived evil of the other. Pocomania is a remarkable play because of the way Marson shows how class, as a natural enemy to feminism, undermines Jamaican national identity and empowerment of the individual, and wonderful also because of the way Marson proudly and unashamedly weaves Jamaican patois in with the English dialogue. Structurally, Pocomania is a play of note too because, as we'll see in London Calling, the major events that involve Stella always take place off stage. We see only the aftermath and the psychological dismantling of this unconventional young woman. The world economic crisis, and now war on the horizon, meant that although her star was once more on the ascendant in Kingston, Marson saw little scope for her ambitions. In 1938, shortly after the success of Pocomania, she seized the opportunity to go back to London to fundraise for JamSave, the Jamaica Save the Children Fund which she had co-founded, and to report for the Jamaican press on the Moyne Commission, an investigation by the British government into the political and economic effects of the Great Depression on the Caribbean region, with the aim of recommending a rescue fund based on its findings. She also found the opportunity to lecture about conditions in Jamaica itself. As on her first trip, Marson stayed on in London despite the outbreak of World War II and the commencement of the Blitz as Nazi Germany bombarded Britain. She took freelance work with the BBC and there found a natural home for her talents. This was a period when she made a brief return to playwriting. In 1940, she dramatised African short stories for use on the continent, of which only one typescript is known to have survived, The Courage of Bokindi, described as the sentimental sketch set in a Central African village. In 1941, she started work as a programme assistant with the BBC Empire Service, aimed at broadcasting to English speakers across the British Empire, and later to be renamed the World Service. Soon after, she finally received the recognition she deserved when she then became the corporation's first black woman producer. The programmers at the BBC were supportive, and in 1942, her creativity now harnessed for a truly global audience, Marson worked on the Calling the West Indies programme for servicemen to have their messages to their families back home read out on the radio. She soon transformed the show into the legendary Caribbean Voices, becoming its producer and broadcaster. Caribbean Voices was a showcase for West Indian writing that helped to nurture and promote the first generation of Caribbean writers in Britain, which included two future Nobel Prize laureates, V.S. Naipaul and Derek Walcott. There's a photograph of Marson at the BBC, taken in the studio of a group working around a table on Voice, a monthly radio magazine programme produced by George Orwell, the writer of Animal Farm and 1984. Marson sits at the centre of the script session, surrounded by Indian writers J. M. Tambamitu and Mulk Raj Anand, and also Benu Chitale, a writer and broadcaster whose legacy as a woman has been similarly overlooked. Looking over Marson's shoulder is Orwell, and at her elbow is the poet T.S. Eliot, all giants of 20th century literature who considered Marson as their equal. With the war's ending, Marson published a volume of collected poems, Towards the Stars, containing poems old and new, many of them evoking life in wartime London and the Blitz, and her reaction to the racial discrimination that persisted through those terrible years. In her poem Politeness, she says, "They tell us that our skin is black, but our hearts are white. We tell them that their skin is white, but their hearts are black." But then, in the same volume, she allows a glimmer of hope for humanity and racial equality once more when, in For There Will Come a Time, she says, "For there will come a time when all the races of the earth, grown weary of the inner urge for gain, grown sick of all the fatness of themselves and their boasted prejudice and pride, will see this vision." Though homesick and depressed by events in her personal life, Marson's reputation and profile had never been higher, and she was able to organise a tour via New York of the Caribbean to report back on the seismic changes in society that had been taking place there during her 7 years away. She travelled more than 2,000 miles in 3 months, zigzagging her way through the islands, a monumental, epic fact-finding trip in which she spoke to everyone from prime ministers to farmers. It was an amazingly successful expedition, but she flew back to London in a deeply exhausted state. In fact, the trip had taken its toll on her mental health, and, as her biographer Delia Jarrett-Macauley records, it is likely that she attempted suicide after suffering a breakdown. In April 1946, she decided to stop working at the BBC and to go back to her homeland. This time, Jamaica proved something of a healing period for Marson, and despite no longer being in her role as the Caribbean's global voice and finding herself ignored by Jamaica's own broadcasters, once recovered, she found herself back in her activist world, publishing and writing for the newspapers and journals. She became the organising secretary for the Nationalist Pioneer Press, the book publishing arm of the Gleaner newspaper, set up to recognise and promote emerging Jamaican writers. She worked tirelessly for the education and empowerment of children in Jamaica through JamSave and urging a book in every home. She also campaigned on other issues, such as highlighting the discrimination waged against the Rastafarians by the government. In 1952, she moved to America, where she stayed for the next 8 years. Ending up in Washington, she worked as a freelance writer and also studied creative writing. Helped by an enthusiastic network of supporters, she attempted to make a name for herself on the American literary circuit. But Marson remained a loner throughout this period and struggled to take advantage of the opportunities that opened up to her. And then, at the age of 55, she got married to a black American dentist, Peter Staples, a widower with 2 grown-up daughters. Their marriage in 1960 lasted little more than a year and, her physical and mental health fading again, Marson returned to Jamaica. She arrived in time to witness her homeland win its long-awaited independence from Britain in 1962, and though she found it hard to find her place in the new nation, Marson picked up again with her social activism. Her physical and mental health would be increasingly fragile for the rest of her life, but that did not mean that she had lost her reputation in many circles overseas, and in 1964 she was invited by Israel's Foreign Minister Golda Meir to attend a 3-day conference in Haifa and Jerusalem for international women leaders on the role of women in the struggle for global peace and development. On the flight back from Israel, she passed through London, where she reported that she found it very changed, not least because of the large number of black people, many of them fellow West Indians, now living in the British cities. The racist attitudes, however, had not changed much. Once arrived in Jamaica, Marson realised that her experience in Israel had invigorated her and she vowed to return. The following year saw her back in Israel working as a house mother at the Mount Carmel Training Centre, educating women in Haifa, and she supplemented her meagre income by writing articles along with the occasional reports for the BBC. By April, she fell ill enough to cause concern for her friends in Israel. One final time, she was forced to return home, and on May the 6th, 1965, Marson died in Kingston of a heart attack. She was 60. As has happened to so many bright lights, especially women, Marson's legacy faded with her passing. If truth be told, it had started to fade long before her passing, and it has taken a shameful number of decades for people to rediscover and herald that legacy. Marson and her work are now being rediscovered by new generations and hailed as the most important woman you've probably never heard of. The expanse of her creative and political work rendered her a complex, diverse, multifaceted writer, difficult to pigeonhole, and especially problematic to fit into a pre-assumed narrative or theory. To know of and grasp all that Marson did is to appreciate the inner strength and resolve needed by a Jamaican woman living in such a relatively conventional and conservative era. Revealing books recently produced include Delia Jarrett-Macaulay's authoritative biography of Marson, followed by a shorter biography by Lisa Tomlinson as part of the Caribbean biography series, selected poems edited by Alison Donnell, and the publication by the National Library of Jamaica and Blouse and Skirt Books' joint collection of Pocomania and London Calling. In the case of London Calling, Marson wrote it in 1934 while she was in England and set it there. Like Pocomania, London Calling has a 3-act structure, and an unconventional female central protagonist. The play reveals a great deal about Marson and her own life experience through its characters and situations, giving London Calling its verisimilitude. London Calling satirises the ignorance of the British about their country's Caribbean subjects. It also probes the loss of connection of Caribbeans with their African heritage and the gendered expectations of women's lives, both themes running through Marson's activist writings. The title itself, London Calling, is a wake-up call, reflecting the BBC's radio call across the globe, announcing broadcasts from the newly launched world service that Marson, as we've seen, later worked for during the 1940s. There is also an argument to more specifically describe the play as a feminist satire, having an aspirational goal to enlighten and instill change. London Calling is a short play, very TV-like, very radio-like even. Similarly to Pocomania, the central events are unseen, and what Marson explores is the aftermath. The play takes place across the seasons of winter and spring, driven by a plot that is an uncomplicated one. A group of Afro-Caribbean university students interact and grapple with social engagements in colonial London. The central students, Rita, her brother Sydney, and their friends Alton and Frank, come from Novica, no voice, a country 7,000 miles away and an invented British colony. They are joined by Prince Alotta, who is from an unnamed African country. Marson most likely had Ghana and Sir Nana Ofori Atta Omeni in mind. There is then the Burton family, Lord and Lady Burton, and their children, Douglas and Elsie, and finally Larkspur, Lady Burton's brother. Marson wrote London Calling in 1934, the year that her stage instructions very specifically place it in, but she waited until she was back in Jamaica to stage it in 1937 in Kingston at the Ward Theatre, where it was received to critical acclaim. Act 1 introduces us to Rita's flatlet, a small self-contained room, one of the small studio apartments converted out of London's large townhouses, situated in the centre of the city, surrounded by the British Museum, universities, teaching hospitals, Inns of Court, and drama schools. We know it's winter from Marson's opening stage directions that set the scene. Winter, 1934. Rita Ray kneeling on rug by coal fire toasting crumpets. She butters last crumpet, covers them by fire, draws curtains, turns on lights, sits on stool by fire and reads. Familiar to British audiences even today, it's a scene far removed from Jamaican everyday life. Right from the start, we are made to understand that Rita is not very happy. As her radio crackles on to announce that temperatures across the land are promising frost from Iceland, Rita's first line is, "Curse this weather!" which alone tells us plenty about Rita and Marson. We also learn that Alton, honourable and devoted, he reminds us of Stella's suitor David in Pocomania, has feelings for Rita. It's something they can openly talk about, and which Rita, just as openly, skirts around. Rita hints at her comparatively more comfortable life back in Novica when she complains about having to, in London, cook and clean her own flat. She reminds us that they've been in England for 2 years, the same as Marson, and she jibes with Alton about privileged white society life, saying, "Maybe if I lived in Mayfair with half a dozen maids, a Rolls Royce and a mink coat, I'd get wonderful feelings too." After an intimate opening segment between Rita and Alton, the other black characters arrive one after the other. Rita's twin brother Sydney, followed by Prince Alotta, and finally the comically Americanized Frank. Between them, they're studying subjects like medicine and law. Rita is at drama school, and, this being London, they're also out to the theatre and dining at clubs a lot. In Act 1, and key to what is to come in Act 2, a couple of letters arrive for Rita. The first is an invitation to stay with Lord and Lady Burton for a week after Christmas. Sydney and Rita have doubts about the Burtons' intentions. "One never knows when these kindnesses are sincere or merely patronising," Sydney observes. The second invitation is from the prestigious International Society. The Novicans have been invited to come to an international social and do a native sketch. Unsurprisingly, Rita and Sydney are uncomfortable with accepting the second invitation as well. They think us fools enough without adding to it of our free will, Sydney asserts. I'm not anxious to dress up in a native costume we do not possess and make a fool of myself before these people. Rita agrees with her brother on this, but in the name of turning things on their head and pulling a prank for their own amusement, Alton convinces them. It'll be great fun, and something to break the monotony anyway. Finally, Sydney and Rita accept, but Rita wants to know what they'll do as a native sketch. As Novicans, and therefore British subjects, they have English ways. No songs, no dances, or national costume, or other language. The point is, they do not have the native identity which the British seem to suppose they own. But Alton has it in hand, and salvation is on the way in the shape of their fellow student, Prince Alotta. When Alotta arrives, Alton explains their predicament to him. We have to give a native sketch at an international party, and as we only have English customs in Novica, we want to borrow from you. And commenting on the link between Africans and the Caribbean, Alton adds in a declaration of kinship, After all, we are cousins. I see, replies Alotta. It is very sad that you have no language, no dress, and no customs. Very sad. But I will help you. With a Pan-African-esque unity established, Alotta helps them to dress in a way more suggestive of his own culture and teaches them a war dance and a song, duly learnt the Novicans enthusiastically practice. Within the experience, we witness the Novicans find a renewed connection to their African ancestry, to themselves, and to each other. Perhaps we even witness them finding a sense of home. It cannot be missed that throughout the play, Rita's beauty is mentioned and exalted as being most manifest when she is dressed in African-style clothes. Underneath the comedic conversations and happenings of Act 1, we see subtle pressures between the characters, silences and miscommunications between the siblings Rita and Sydney, frustrations of Alton to keep positive in a city of walking iceboxes, which he worries his friends are slowly becoming part of. It's a chance for us to consider the experience of the diaspora, being changed and pulled apart when so far from home, and also the aspects that unite us, no matter what. We know that the black characters are pained by the reality of the racism they experience in London, and although a satire, in London Calling, Marson allows herself to cut through in a luminous way, letting Rita speak to us directly, giving an affecting monologue once she is alone again with Alton. I know we must suffer these things, and that it will be another generation before we finally find our feet, but sometimes it comes over me. I can't stand it. It hurts so, here, deep down in my heart, in my soul, worse than a physical pain. It is a startling emotional moment, allowing us to connect with Rita's concerns, understanding her as an individual. Act 1 finishes with Rita alone, gently sobbing, while soft music titled No Place Like Home plays in the background, and we are invited further into Rita's internal monologue. The intimacy we are permitted makes Rita a black female role model, rare in English literature, especially of the 1930s, making Marson through her writing even more of a pioneer. Act 2 takes place a month later at the stately home of Lord and Lady Burton in the county of Kent, not far from London. Like a Greek drama, the act begins post the central event of the Novicans' performance at the International Social, and we jump straight into the conversational aftermath. The Burtons are trying not to have a family row about whether or not the Novicans should have been invited to their home in the first place. We meet Lady Burton for the first time as she anxiously discusses their impending guests with her son Douglas and daughter Elsie. We hear Lady Burton's pervading distress over the actions of her maid. I told Mabel to hunt up the old sheets and put them on their beds. And instead of that, she's used our best ones. Marson further exposes Lady Burton's dishonesty by having Lady Burton greet the Novicans saying, "We are delighted to have you with us," only to let her confide, once alone again with her family, what a worry and anxiety it is having these people here. The neighbours, what will they say? The white characters display their racial discrimination, often making stereotypical and prejudicial remarks. For example, Douglas saying, "Just suppose they bring their funny idols and make funny noises and burn things in their rooms." The plot thickens as on their arrival, the Novicans put on the pidgin English from their performance at the International Social, playing on the racist assumptions of the white hosts and empowering the black characters. Sydney, Alton and Rita have also given themselves pretend native-sounding names, Kwato, Kwamin and Kwamina. And it works. Lord Burton observes to his guests, "You speak good English now. My daughter told me you only knew a few words then." Alton teasingly responds, "Yes, you see, we work hard and learn much. Every day we learn one pretty little word." Soon after the prank is established, an unexpected guest, Larkspur, arrives at the mansion. Larkspur is Lady Burton's brother and an anthropologist who has travelled the world and now sees his role in London to break down racial and social barriers, perhaps a little mischievously. Larkspur is also a friend of the Novicans, and his arrival is a risk to their game. Being caught off guard, Rita has to explain to Larkspur once they are alone with him. "We were very bored in London, and we took part in an international party and did native sketches, which we made up and said they were of our country. We have to speak very broken English, as at the party we only knew a few words." Learning about the prank his friends are playing, Larkspur says, revealing the pun in his name, "You are not the only ones up to larks." Bum bum. Larkspur has already been up to his own mischief and arranged for the Burtons to be snapped unwittingly by a paparazzi press photographer on the mansion's balcony with their foreign guests, the publicity of which he knows will mortify his family. Act 2, Scene 2 opens with Larkspur laughing over all that has happened at the Burtons' mansion the day before. Lord Burton is hugely unimpressed. "Larkspur, I don't mind telling you I wish you safely in hell, roasting as brown as your cursed Negroes." We learn through a letter left by them that the Novicans have secretly left the mansion first thing that morning, giving a profuse apology for their prank, revealing their true names, and graciously thanking the Burtons for their generous hospitality. Larkspur calls it all a comedy of errors. "All's well that ends well, a storm in a teacup." Shakespearean references from British idioms litter Marson's work. Larkspur encourages Lord Burton to lighten up about all that has occurred, which Lord Burton eventually does, but Lord Burton also laments from his own perspective and family position that one is not free. It's a profound reflection that is later revisited by his daughter Elsie, as well as Rita and Sydney in Act 3. Through such reflections and insights, Marson continues to give us the chance to consider the complexities of her characters, their flaws and vulnerabilities, and what is really going on behind the surface. A real-life event that was happening at the time Marson was writing London Calling was the making of Sanders of the River. The 1935 adventure film set in Nigeria, Sanders of the River starred London-based Americans Paul Robeson and Nina Mae McKinney, who was known as the Black Garbo, and Marson references the film very brilliantly. We learn that Lord Burton has arranged for the Novicans to connect up with his film producer friend, Picklove, who on seeing the evening press photos of the Burtons with the Novicans has been phoning a dozen times to ask to come and see these curiosities. The connection to Picklove leads to the black character's involvement in a film with a parody title of Bronze Idol. When filming the real-life Sanders of the River, Robeson gave guinea a day welcome parts to members of the black community in Britain, and this is echoed through Frank and Prince Alotta's potential involvement in the bronze idol as extras. When Sanders of the River was completed, Robeson was furious at the way the film had been edited to make his African king subservient to the white colonial officials, and he even attempted, unsuccessfully, to buy back all the prints of Sanders of the River to prevent it from being shown in the cinemas. Sanders of the River also provoked outcry from the top-ranking Nigerians based in London over the portrayal of their country. As it turned out, the film was a huge box office success. Marson's reference to it here in London Calling is a perfect build on the play's commentary on the stereotyping of Africans and the bigoted colonial gaze that the play so sharply exposes. We are set up for Act 3 by learning that Larkspur is considering proposing to Rita. He is unsure as to whether or not Rita will accept, or even whether Rita is available. He thinks she may be engaged to Alton. Larkspur tells Lord Burton of his intentions with Rita, who on hearing about it wants to know, "But seriously, would you marry a coloured woman?" Act 2 ends and Act 3 begins with the topic of Rita's matrimony at the centre. Act 3, the final act, is set a handful of months later, in spring. The play's finale involves all the other characters knocking on Rita's door in a comically choreographed nod to Agatha Christie's Poirot. Beginning in the same way as Act 1, with Rita and Alton at first alone, Rita tells Alton, "I'm going to marry dear old Larkspur." "What? Larkspur? How long has this been going on?" "For donkey's years." "Do be serious." Rita insists that she is. Sydney enters the flat and, seeing Alton acting melancholy, asks, "Did I interrupt anything?" Rita dismisses Alton's mood, but Sydney, ever suspicious, knows something's afoot. "I don't believe you're really marrying Larkspur." Dismissing the suspicion of her brother, Rita is not ready to reveal. "Run away for your row. I promise we'll have a chat tonight." Sydney and Alton leave to go for a row on the Serpentine boating lake in Hyde Park, and Rita begins to fix tea and prepare for an afternoon with Larkspur. The doorbell rings, but rather than it being her expected guest, Larkspur, Rita opens the door to Alotta and Frank, who have come especially to quiz Rita. "Say, honey, don't think me rude, but someone told me that you are engaged to Mr. Larkspur." Frank probes Rita, who confides to Frank and Alotta, "I will tell you the truth. Kind Mr. Larkspur really did ask me to marry him, but I did not accept. No one else knows this. Not a whisper till I give the word." Before they can discuss further, the doorbell rings again. Larkspur has arrived. Rita ushers the uninvited Frank and Alotta out of her flatlet to another part of the house. Alotta and Frank are out of sight, but can hear every word. Soon after, Rita and Larkspur have shared pleasantries, but before they can discuss anything further, the doorbell rings again. Yet another unexpected visitor, this time Douglas, Larkspur's nephew. Rita rushes Larkspur behind the door. Larkspur, along with Frank and Alotta, become out-of-sight witnesses to the action in the room. Douglas informs Rita of his intention to go to Novica to manage the Novicans' wealth for them, and then wants to discuss a serious matter. "My father tells me you are likely to marry Uncle. There has never been a scandal in our family before. I know I can't stop this, but I want you to promise not to marry him in England." Before the dialogue can rise to a full confrontation, the doorbell rings again. It's Douglas's sister, Elsie. Rita pushes Douglas under the divan. Elsie enters, believing she and Rita are totally alone. Rita, enjoying it all, invites Elsie to sit down on the divan. Douglas is underneath. A classic farce moment. Elsie explains that she has come to apologise on behalf of her family and all that occurred over Christmas at their home, before getting down to her view on the engagement. "I am so pleased about it. I admire Uncle so much for having the courage of his convictions." Continuing the sentiment of her father in Act 2, when he spoke of his lack of freedom, there is then a break in the comedic action. and Elsie gives us her own reflections on the freedom theme with a poignant monologue. I think it is terrible how most of us live under the delusion that we are free when we are really in bondage. Bondage to our parents, our tradition, our social status, our wealth. There is so much we dare not do. Sydney and Autumn return to the flat, and on hearing their voices, Rita hides Elsie behind a screen. As with Alotta, Frank, Larkspur and Douglas, Elsie is in earshot, but unseen. We learn that Sydney is accusing Rita of preventing his summer vacation to Novica, saying their mother back home will not allow him to leave Rita in London alone, and unmarried. The theme of freedom is revisited once again, with Rita commenting with sardonic humour, "My poor brother condemns me to matrimony." When Autumn dramatically declares to Rita, "I love you. I have loved you for so many years. I am sure we need each other," Rita responds with just a little less drama, "I'm weary of persuading myself we don't." The play ends with an Agatha Christie-style moment of reveal. Rita confirms very clearly that if she will marry, it will be Autumn. "What?" is the response from the gathered but hidden voices darted around the flat, followed by a quick curtain. Like a modern sitcom, London Calling plays on social commentary, situations, spot-on characterisation and elements of farce, tossed in to create an entertaining, accessible vehicle for what is a powerful and enlightening message. What makes the play come especially alive is the contemporary credibility that stems from real autobiographical moments of Marson's own encounters in London. As a reporter, Marson was reporting discrimination as it still is to this day, and what we've been seeing in London Calling is life through the eyes of our black female protagonist, Rita. Despite this remarkable run of plays, Marson wrote no more full-length works that we know of. Understandably, her later work for the BBC focused her creative energy in other ways that carried the message just as effectively, but the shame is that the plays that she had written didn't enter the theatre repertory or literary canon, largely due to them remaining unpublished for so long. We're lucky that London Calling and Pocomania have now been published, but using a manuscript that was crumbling away, and in the case of London Calling, missing 2 pages of dialogue. There's little information on the whereabouts of At What a Price, or whether anyone today has actually read it. At this present moment in 2021, despite being in print, Marson's plays are still absent from our stages, and assumptions continue to be made. For example, London Calling is still referred to as being about an African prince from an imaginary African colony who has farcical encounters with the upper classes. A huge assumption is made, and the woman, in this case Rita, is removed from the narrative. What Una Marson, the playwright, has left us should be in every theatre repertory and literary canon. London Calling and Pocomania are not museum period pieces, but continue to resonate. Part of why they deserve to be on our curriculums and stages is because they are significant in platforming a convincing black feminist narrative at a time when this was only beginning to be simply seen by others as possible, London Calling being a key stepping stone to the pure black narrative of Pocomania. We'll leave the last word to Marson. From Winifred Holtby, a poem that Marson penned in memory of a friend who was a British peace activist. These lines are perfect too, to sum up Ms. Marson herself. O valiant woman, author, speaker, friend, with sympathies as wide as they were true. Thy heart was like a fount where all might bend, to drink and find their faith in life anew.
That was The Plays of Una Marson, narrated by Ayesha Casely-Hayford.